After asking one heartbreaking question, Jimin forces Jungkook to confront the painful truth that has been silently tearing them apart. Loudly crying face, was all of this worth hurting me? Jimin's question left Jungkook speechless. Was all of this worth hurting me? The words escaped Jimin's trembling lips before the sound of the heavy rain swallowed the silence between them. Jungkook froze. His fingers, still wrapped around the soaked envelope he had chased across the deserted parking lot, slowly loosened until it slipped onto the wet pavement. Water seeped into the paper, blurring the ink that had already destroyed more than either of them wanted to admit. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Only the relentless rain kept speaking. Jimin stood several steps away beneath the flickering streetlight, his white shirt clinging to his body, dark hair dripping over eyes that had spent too many nights pretending not to cry. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't accusing. That somehow hurt far more. Jungkook searched for an answer, but every sentence he had rehearsed over the past month suddenly felt meaningless. Nothing came out. Jimin gave a quiet laugh, one completely empty of happiness. I thought, he whispered, if you ever decided to leave me behind, you'd at least look me in the eyes. His voice cracked before he could finish. Jungkook instinctively stepped forward. Jimin. No, one word stopped him. It wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. For the first time in years, Jimin looked at Jungkook as though he were a stranger standing on the opposite side of an invisible wall. The distance between them was only a few meters. It felt impossible to, weeks earlier. Everything had still looked normal. Jimin still laughed whenever Jungkook stole food from his plate. Jungkook still texted him good morning before sunrise. Their routines were so familiar that neither realized how fragile they had become. But hidden beneath ordinary conversations was a secret Jungkook carried alone. Every evening after practice, he disappeared for nearly 2 hours. Whenever Jimin asked where he had been, Jungkook smiled. Just taking care of something. Answer never changed. At first, Jimin believed him. Trust had always come naturally. Then small things began disappearing. Conversations ended halfway through. Messages stayed unread. Phone calls were declined. Jungkook started smiling less, even when everyone else was laughing. It wasn't that he became cold, he simply became distant. The difference was subtle, yet Jimin noticed everything. He always did, because loving someone wasn't only about remembering birthdays or favorite songs. Sometimes it meant noticing the silence growing between sentences. One evening, while waiting inside their favorite cafe, Jimin watched Jungkook glance nervously at his phone before leaving without finishing his coffee. Be back in 10 minutes. He never returned. Jimin sat alone until the cafe closed. The untouched cup across from him had gone cold. That was the first night fear quietly entered his heart. Jimin hated suspicion. He hated the version of himself that checked the clock every 5 minutes. The version that reread old conversations searching for hidden meanings. The version that smiled in front of everyone while wondering whether he had already been replaced in someone else's life. He wanted to trust, he truly did. But unanswered questions have a way of becoming louder than spoken promises. Days later, Jimin accidentally found the envelope. It had fallen from Jungkook's backpack while they were organizing old books. Across the front was written only one sentence. Don't let Jimin know yet. Nothing else, no sender, no explanation, no signature. Jimin stared at those words until his vision blurred. He wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation instead. His imagination created hundreds. Perhaps Jungkook was leaving. Perhaps someone had threatened him. Perhaps there was another person. The possibilities were endless. None of them brought peace. So Jimin quietly placed the envelope back exactly where he had found it. He never mentioned it. He waited. He hoped Jungkook would tell him first. Days passed, then weeks. The silence continued growing. Jungkook carried his own storm. Every morning he stood before the bathroom mirror repeating the same sentence. Just a little longer. He didn't know whether he was trying to convince himself or his reflection. Inside his apartment closet rested dozens of unfinished sketches, concert stage designs, letters, photographs, receipts, tiny souvenirs collected over years. He had been secretly preparing something that was supposed to heal an old wound Jimin rarely spoke about. Years ago, Jimin had abandoned his dream after a devastating failure. He never admitted how much it still haunted him. But Jungkook knew, because sometimes Jimin unconsciously stopped walking whenever they passed the old theater. His smile always faded for exactly 3 seconds. No one else noticed. Jungkook did, so he decided to rebuild that dream piece by piece, quietly, patiently. Without telling anyone, he wanted the surprise to erase years of regret. Instead, his silence became another kind of pain. The misunderstanding reached its breaking point on the night of the rain. Jimin followed Jungkook after receiving an anonymous message. If you want the truth, come alone. Nothing more. The address led him to an abandoned community theater. Inside, workers moved boxes across the dusty stage. Old lights flickered overhead. Fresh paint filled the air. In the center of the room stood Jungkook. Surrounded by blueprints, flowers, lighting equipment, and a massive banner still covered by cloth, Jimin didn't understand what he was seeing before he could ask. Another person entered and hugged Jungkook in celebration. It finally worked. Jimin saw only the embrace, not the words, not the explanation, only the hug. His heart interpreted everything before his mind had the chance. He turned and ran. Jungkook shouted after him. The storm outside drowned every syllable now, back beneath the streetlight. They finally faced one another. Jungkook slowly picked up the ruined envelope. Rainwater had washed away part of the handwriting. He handed it to Jimin. Open it. Jimin hesitated, then unfolded the soaked paper. Inside wasn't a goodbye, it wasn't a confession, it wasn't evidence of betrayal, it was a handwritten list, a reopening ceremony, guest invitations, a speech Jungkook had rewritten nearly 20 times. At the bottom was one sentence: "Welcome home, Jimin, your dream has been waiting for you." Jimin stopped breathing, his eyes moved across every page again and again. "I don't understand." Jungkook finally smiled. It was exhausted, fragile, almost broken. "I wanted to rebuild the theater where you gave up your dream." His voice shook. "You always said that building was where your happiest memories ended. So I wanted it to become where they began again." Tears mixed with the rain on Jimin's face. "You disappeared. I was negotiating with the owners. You ignored my messages. I didn't want you to accidentally find out. The envelope. I asked everyone to keep it secret until everything was finished." Silence returned. This time, it wasn't cruel, only heavy. Jimin lowered his head. "I spent weeks believing you didn't need me anymore." Jungkook stepped closer. "I spent weeks believing protecting the surprise meant protecting your happiness." Both of them had made the same mistake. Neither had trusted the other with their fears. Jimin let out a slow breath. "When I asked if all of this was worth hurting me," he looked directly into Jungkook's eyes. "I wasn't talking about the surprise." Jungkook listened quietly. "I was asking whether carrying everything alone was worth making us lonely." Those words struck deeper than any accusation ever could. Jungkook nodded slowly. "No," he answered without hesitation. "It wasn't." Rain finally softened into a gentle drizzle. The clouds slowly drifted apart. For the first time that night, neither of them rushed to explain anything else. Some wounds didn't disappear because of grand gestures. They healed because honesty finally arrived. Jimin folded the damp papers carefully before slipping them back into the envelope. Then, after everything that had been left unsaid for weeks, he reached forward, not dramatically, not desperately, simply enough for Jungkook to understand. Jungkook accepted the gesture without a word. Together, they walked toward the old theater, where the scent of fresh paint lingered in the cool evening air, where dusty seats waited to welcome new memories, and where dreams once abandoned quietly found the courage to begin again. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, they were willing to face it side by side, no longer hiding behind silence, and no longer allowing love to become a language of unanswered questions. Morning sunlight spilled through the restored theater's towering windows, turning the floating dust into strands of gold. The building no longer felt abandoned. Workers crossed the stage carrying wooden panels, electricians tested the lights one by one, and somewhere backstage the faint melody of a piano drifted through the empty hall. Jimin stood alone in the center aisle. He slowly ran his fingertips across the velvet seats that had once witnessed his greatest disappointment. Years ago, he had walked away from this place believing he would never return. Now every familiar corner awakened memories he had buried so deeply that even hearing the creak of the old floorboards made his chest tighten. Behind him, Jungkook watched in silence. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times, yet none of those imagined versions compared to reality. He expected Jimin to smile immediately, to feel relieved, perhaps even overwhelmed with joy. Instead, Jimin looked frightened. Not of the theater, of himself. "You can leave if this is too much," Jungkook said softly. Jimin shook his head. "If I leave again," he whispered, "I'm afraid I'll never have the courage to come back." Jungkook walked beside him without another word. Sometimes encouragement did not need speeches. Sometimes simply staying beside someone was enough. They climbed onto the stage together. The polished wooden floor reflected the morning light, but in Jimin's mind it still carried echoes of applause that had suddenly stopped years before. He closed his eyes. For a brief second, he could almost hear the voice of his younger self. "Never be good enough." Sentence returned as vividly as the day he first heard it. It had come from a harsh judge after a performance that meant everything to him. The criticism had spread through social media. Strangers had mocked him without mercy, and Jimin slowly convinced himself that dreams were only meant for people stronger than he was. No one had realized that he never truly gave up because of failure. He gave up because he believed the world had already decided who he was. Jungkook noticed Jimin's hands beginning to tremble. Without thinking, he reached over and gently covered them with his own. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Min opened his eyes. "I know," his voice was quiet, "but convincing my heart is much harder than convincing my mind." Rehearsal began an hour later. Technicians adjusted microphones while stage managers discussed lighting cues. Everyone greeted Jimin warmly, unaware that every step he took across the stage felt like walking through memories that refused to disappear. At first everything went smoothly. Jimin spoke confidently. He smiled. He even laughed when one of the lights flickered unexpectedly. Jungkook finally allowed himself to breathe. Maybe everything really was going to be all right. Then the auditorium speakers suddenly produced a burst of sharp feedback. The piercing sound echoed through the theater. Instantly, Jimin froze. His breathing became uneven. The sound reminded him of the exact moment years ago when technical problems had ruined his performance before thousands of people. He had spent years pretending that memory no longer affected him. His body remembered. Hart remembered. Before anyone understood what was happening, Jimin quietly stepped off the stage and disappeared behind the curtains. Jungkook followed immediately. He found him sitting alone in a narrow backstage hallway, his head resting against the cold brick wall. "I ruined everything again," Jimin murmured. "You didn't ruin anything. I couldn't even finish one rehearsal. You stopped because your memories hurt." Jimin laughed bitterly. "Isn't that the same thing?" Jungkook slowly sat beside him. "No." There was no hesitation in his answer. "Spent years believing fear makes you weak." He looked directly at Jimin. "But showing fear means you're finally facing it instead of running." Silence settled between them. This silence felt different from the painful one they had shared before. It carried understanding instead of distance. Jimin stared at the floor for a long time before speaking again. "When I left this place years ago," he swallowed hard, "I promised myself I would never cry here again." "Still want to?" Jungkook smiled gently. "Then cry." Jimin looked at him, surprised. "You don't always have to be brave." Those simple words broke something inside him, not in a painful way. In the way frozen rivers finally begin to melt, tears slowly rolled down Jimin's face. He did not hide them. He did not apologize. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to grieve not only the dream he had lost, but also the version of himself he had abandoned after believing he would never be enough. Jungkook stayed beside him the entire time. He never interrupted. He never rushed him. He simply remained there until the tears gradually stopped. Later that afternoon, Jimin walked back onto the stage. His steps were still hesitant, but they no longer carried the same fear. When the rehearsal music began again, he closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and took his place beneath the bright lights. This time he did not perform to erase the past. He performed to accept it. Every movement felt lighter, every breath steadier. When the final note faded into silence, the workers scattered throughout the theater began applauding without anyone asking them to. The applause was neither loud nor extravagant. It was sincere. Jimin smiled through moist eyes, not because he believed he had become perfect, but because after so many years, he had finally stopped measuring his worth by perfection. As the sun slowly dipped beyond the theater windows, the building seemed warmer than it had that morning. The old walls no longer felt like a prison filled with regret. They had become witnesses to something far more important than a flawless performance. They had witnessed the quiet return of hope. Jimin and Jungkook left the theater together beneath the orange evening sky. Neither of them spoke during the walk home. They no longer felt pressured to fill every silence with explanations. Some silences were no longer empty. Some simply meant two hearts had finally begun healing at the same pace.
The city was still wrapped in the pale blue light of dawn when Jimin unlocked the theater's front door. The cool scent of fresh paint lingered in the air, mixing with the aroma of coffee that one of the stage crew had left on the ticket counter. Everything felt strangely peaceful, as though the building itself had been waiting for this morning. Jimin paused just inside the entrance. His reflection stared back at him from the polished glass doors. For years, he had avoided looking at himself before performances. Every reflection reminded him of expectations he believed he could never meet. Today, however, he held his own gaze for several quiet seconds. "Changed," he whispered to himself, not because the fear had disappeared, because it no longer controlled him. Behind him, Jungkook entered carrying 2 paper cups of warm coffee. "I guessed you skipped breakfast again." Jimin accepted one with a sheepish smile. "You know me too well." Had years of practice. Laughed together and the sound echoed softly through the empty lobby. It was a simple moment, but one that neither of them took for granted anymore. After everything they had survived, ordinary mornings had become precious. As rehearsals continued over the next few days, the theater gradually came alive. Costumes arrived, musicians tuned their instruments, and the stage transformed into something far more beautiful than either of them had imagined. Jimin worked harder than anyone, sometimes too hard. Long after everyone else had gone home, he remained alone beneath the stage lights, repeating the same movements again and again. One evening, Jungkook quietly stood at the back of the auditorium, watching without interrupting. Jimin stumbled, he stopped, started again, missed another cue, started over once more. His breathing became heavier with every attempt. Finally, Jungkook walked onto the stage. "Many times have you done that routine? I lost count." "How many mistakes have you made?" Jimin sighed. "Enough." Jungkook smiled gently. "And how many times have you gotten back up?" Jimin looked at him, confused. "I don't know," I counted. Jungkook stepped closer. 32. Jimin blinked. "What? You've fallen 32 times." He smiled wider. "And you've stood up 32 times." A long moment, Jimin simply stared at him, then he laughed, a genuine laugh, perhaps the first one that hadn't carried hidden sadness in weeks. "You really count everything. Count the important things." Jimin lowered his eyes. "No one ever counted how many times I stood back up. They do now. Those words settled quietly inside Jimin's heart. Not every wound needed dramatic healing. Sometimes healing arrived through someone noticing the victories you had stopped noticing yourself. The following afternoon, the theater opened its doors for a small preview rehearsal attended by close friends, sponsors, and members of the local arts community. The audience was small, barely 50 people. Yet to Jimin, it felt larger than any crowd he had ever faced. His palms became damp, his breathing short. He stood behind the curtain, listening to the muffled conversations beyond the stage. What if they hate it? Jungkook adjusted the microphone clip to Jimin's jacket. What if they love it? Jimin smiled nervously. You always answer my fears with another question. Because fear likes pretending it already knows the future. Stage manager gave the signal. The curtain slowly began to rise. Warm light spilled across the stage. Jimin stepped forward. For one terrifying second, every painful memory rushed back. The criticism, the humiliation, the loneliness. Then his eyes found Jungkook standing quietly near the wings. Jungkook didn't give a thumbs up. He didn't tell Jimin to smile. He simply nodded once. A silent reminder, I'm here. Jimin inhaled deeply. Then he began. His voice was steady, not perfect, human. Every word carried the weight of someone who had survived disappointment and still found the courage to speak again. As the performance unfolded, the audience leaned forward, completely absorbed. Some smiled, some quietly wiped away tears. By the final scene, the theater had fallen into complete silence, not the uncomfortable kind. The kind created when every heart in the room is feeling the same emotion. When the lights faded, applause slowly filled the hall. It grew louder, longer, warmer. Jimin bowed, tears gathering in his eyes. This applause sounded nothing like the applause he had once dreamed about. It wasn't louder, it wasn't grander, it simply felt real. After the audience had left, Jimin remained alone on the stage. He looked up toward the empty balcony where he had once believed his dreams had ended. They didn't end here, he whispered. They were only waiting. Jungkook walked onto the stage carrying the forgotten bouquet someone had left behind. Without saying anything, he handed it to Jimin. Jimin accepted it with both hands. I almost lost you because neither of us knew how to speak honestly. Jungkook nodded. And now I think honesty is harder than courage. Jungkook smiled softly. But it's worth learning. They stood together beneath the dim stage lights while the theater slowly emptied around them. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of rain once again, but this time neither of them feared the coming storm. Some storms arrived to destroy. Others arrived to wash away the last traces of yesterday's pain. Jimin looked toward the open theater doors, where the fading sunset painted the sky with soft shades of orange and violet. For the first time in many years, tomorrow no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something to welcome. The official opening night arrived beneath a sky painted with countless stars, and the restored theater glowed like a forgotten dream brought back to life. Warm lights spilled onto the stone steps outside as guests slowly filled the entrance, their conversations blending with the gentle sound of a string quartet playing in the lobby. From behind the curtain, Jimin listened to every distant laugh, every footstep, every heartbeat that seemed to echo inside his own chest. He had imagined this night for years. Now that it had finally arrived, he was afraid to move. Jungkook quietly approached, carrying a neatly folded handkerchief. You forgot this. Jimin smiled faintly. Never seen anyone prepare for opening night by bringing tissues. I know you. Jungkook slipped the handkerchief into Jimin's pocket. You always pretend you're not nervous. I'm nervous. I know. Jimin looked down at his hands, shaking again. Jungkook gently held one of them. So are mine. Jimin looked up in surprise. Been afraid all day. Why? Jungkook let out a quiet breath. Because this isn't only your dream anymore. He glanced toward the stage. It's ours. Those simple words settled warmly inside Jimin's heart. For so long, he had carried every burden alone. Even when someone offered to help, he believed accepting support meant admitting weakness. Now he understood something different. Sharing a dream did not make it smaller, it made it stronger. The stage manager gave a gentle signal. 5 minutes. The audience had filled every seat, the lights dimmed. An excited hush swept across the theater. Jimin closed his eyes one final time. Instead of remembering failure, he remembered every moment that had brought him here. The rainy night beneath the streetlight, the painful misunderstanding, the rebuilt theater, the rehearsals, the tears he no longer hid. And Jungkook, who had quietly remained beside him through every uncertain step. When the curtain slowly opened, a wave of warm light embraced the stage. Jimin stepped forward. This time, his heartbeat did not feel like an enemy. It felt like proof that he was alive. The performance unfolded with a quiet confidence that surprised even him. Every movement flowed naturally. Every word carried sincerity instead of fear. The audience laughed when the story invited laughter. They fell silent during its quietest moments. Some openly wiped tears from their eyes before the final act had even begun. Jungkook watched from backstage. He barely noticed his own smile growing wider with every passing minute. This was the Jimin he had always believed still existed beneath years of doubt, not fearless, courageous. There was a difference. Fearless people never felt afraid. Courageous people walked forward anyway. As the final scene came to an end, the stage lights slowly softened. Silence filled the theater. It lasted only a few seconds, then applause erupted. People rose from their seats one after another until the entire audience was standing. The sound surrounded Jimin like a warm embrace. Years ago, applause had felt like something he desperately needed. Tonight, it felt like a beautiful gift rather than a measure of his worth. Jimin bowed deeply. When he lifted his head again, his eyes searched the wings. Jungkook was there. Their eyes met across the stage. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Everything they had struggled to say during those painful weeks had already been answered through trust, rebuilt one honest conversation at a time. After the audience gradually departed, the theater became quiet once more. Only a handful of staff members remained, carefully turning off lights and collecting programs left behind on the seats. Jimin wandered onto the empty stage again. Without the audience, it felt strangely peaceful. Jungkook joined him carrying 2 cups of hot tea. "I thought tonight deserved something warmer than coffee." Jimin accepted one with a grateful smile. "I used to think success would erase every painful memory. Now," Jimin looked across the rows of empty seats, "I don't want to erase them anymore." Jungkook listened quietly. "They remind me how far I've come." A gentle breeze drifted through the open stage door, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers from the small garden outside. For several minutes, they simply stood together in comfortable silence. Finally, Jimin spoke again. "Thank you," Jungkook chuckled softly. "Already thanked me 100 times. I'm not thanking you for rebuilding the theater." Then Jimin turned toward him. "I'm thanking you for staying, even when I made it difficult." Jungkook smiled with quiet warmth. "You stayed too." Words lingered between them. Relationships were rarely saved by one person alone. They survived because both people chose again and again to keep walking toward each other instead of away. As midnight approached, they stepped outside together. The theater lights remained glowing behind them, casting a golden reflection across the quiet street. Jimin looked back one last time. The building no longer represented the place where his dream had ended. It had become the place where he learned that dreams were not sustained by applause, perfection, or success. They were sustained by hope, honesty, forgiveness, and the people who refused to let you face your darkest moments alone. With a peaceful smile, Jimin and Jungkook walked into the quiet night side by side, leaving behind a theater that no longer held echoes of regret, but memories of healing, resilience, and a future they were finally ready to embrace together. Several weeks passed after the opening night, and the theater slowly became one of the city's most beloved places. Every evening, people gathered beneath its glowing marquee, filling the seats with laughter, quiet anticipation, and heartfelt applause. The once forgotten building had become a home for stories, music, and second chances. Jimin still arrived before everyone else. It had become a habit. He liked walking through the silent auditorium before sunrise, when the rows of empty seats were bathed in pale morning light, and the stage belonged only to him. The quiet no longer reminded him of loneliness. It reminded him that every new day offered another opportunity to begin again. One morning, as he adjusted a spotlight, he noticed Jungkook standing in the back row with his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Been watching me for 5 minutes," Jimin called out with a smile. "I was waiting." "What? For you to notice?" Jimin laughed as he climbed down from the stage. "You could have just said good morning. I wanted to make sure you're not working before breakfast again." Jimin lowered his head, unable to hide a guilty smile. I forgot. You always forget. Jungkook handed him a small paper bag. Inside were warm pastries and a cup of tea. You really think of everything, Jungkook replied quietly. Just remember the things that make you smile. Words lingered in Jimin's heart long after breakfast was over. As the days passed, the theater welcomed young performers from across the city. Some dreamed of becoming actors. Others wanted to sing, dance, or simply stand beneath the lights without fear. One afternoon, a shy teenager arrived for an audition. His hands trembled so badly that he dropped his script before even stepping onto the stage. I'm sorry, the boy whispered. I don't think I can do this. Jimin gently picked up the scattered pages and handed them back. You know something? The boy shook his head. I was once so afraid that I almost gave up forever. Teenager looked at him in surprise. But everyone says you're confident. Jimin smiled. Only seeing today's version of me. Boy stared quietly at the stage. What changed? Jimin thought for a moment before answering. I stopped believing that one failure could define the rest of my life. Boy nodded slowly. With renewed determination, he walked back to the center of the stage and began again. Watching him, Jungkook couldn't help but smile. Without realizing it, Jimin had become the kind of person he once needed himself. That evening, after rehearsals ended, the theater was once again wrapped in peaceful silence. Jimin and Jungkook sat together on the edge of the stage, with their feet dangling above the orchestra pit. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence felt familiar, comfortable. Jimin finally broke it. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't followed you that rainy night? Jungkook let out a slow breath. I do. And I think we both would have kept pretending everything was fine. Jimin nodded. That's what scares me. Jungkook looked toward the empty auditorium. We weren't almost separated because we stopped caring. We're almost separated because we stopped sharing what we were afraid of. Jimin quietly repeated those words to himself. They were painfully true. Love had never disappeared between them. Only honesty had. A gentle breeze drifted through the open backstage door, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain from outside. Jimin smiled. I used to hate rainy days, I remember. They always reminded me of losing everything. He looked toward the large theater windows where tiny raindrops shimmered beneath the evening lights. But now, Jungkook waited. They remind me of the day we finally stopped hiding. Jungkook smiled softly. Take that as progress. Jimin laughed. No, he shook his head. Call it healing. For a long while, they simply listened to the rain tapping softly against the windows. There was no urgency anymore. No misunderstandings waiting around the corner. No words left trapped behind fear. Only two people who had learned that trust was not built in extraordinary moments alone. It was built every ordinary day through honesty, patience, and the quiet decision to keep choosing each other. When the rain finally stopped, moonlight spilled across the empty stage, illuminating the polished floor where Jimin had once believed his dreams had ended forever. Now, that same stage reflected something entirely different, not perfection, not fame, but peace. Jimin stood and extended a hand toward Jungkook. Come on. Where are we going? Jimin smiled with quiet confidence. Tomorrow's rehearsal starts early. Jungkook accepted his hand. And tomorrow, Jimin looked around the theater one last time before turning off the final stage light. Tomorrow, we keep building something worth protecting. Together, they stepped into the cool night air, leaving behind a theater filled not only with performances, but with the quiet reminder that even the deepest wounds could become the foundation for a brighter future when they were met with understanding, forgiveness, and unwavering hope.